One. All right, we're recording. Hey guys, this is Andrew Vargas. Some of you know me, I'm a realtor in Southern California. I'm here with my friend, Tony Martin. We've known each other for many years, and he's a history teacher. And the reason why I have him on today is to kind of go over past events that happened so we're better prepared for the future. A lot of us kind of forget the past, and that leads to many problems. Tony?
Yep. I agree with everything you just said.
Yep.
Yeah, so you just wanted me to talk a little bit about my background, or?
Yeah, go for it. Please
Yeah,
do.
so I'm a social studies teacher here in California. I teach in the public school sphere, and I teach at Esperanza High School in Anaheim, California. It's a part of the Placentia Yorba Linda School District, but I have taught for a number of years in the private sector as well. And yeah, I have my degrees are from California. I've had an array of teaching experiences with all kinds of students, English learners, special needs. I also did substitute teaching for a couple of years too, with some long assignments. But my main background is history. That's where I went to school for. I have a master's degree in history, and I also have more of a background in like Latin American history. I took an array of courses, but yeah, so that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I remember growing up, as we kind of grew up through childhood together. I remember seeing you always hooked on reading about history, watching the History Channel and things like that. You've always been very passionate. Now, what subjects are you normally most experienced in when it comes to history? I know you mentioned Latin America, but is there anything else in particular you like to focus on the most?
Well, as a high school teacher, I've always taught. Every year I've been teaching, I've taught world history, high school world history. So that's 10th graders mainly. So we go all the way we do like a review unit of the rise of democracy and democratic ideas, and it ends all the way with kind of a little bit of the modern world. We look a little bit at modern terrorism. So I kind of teach the kids about 9/11 at the end of the year, but we cover in the first semester, like I said, we kind of review democratic ideas. We end with World War I in the first semester, and then second semester we start with kind of revolution and nationalism, things that went on in India, for instance. Like, so we learn I teach a little bit about Gandhi and how he used civil disobedience to gain independence for India. And then I spent a good amount of time on, what we call the years of crisis, which is kind of a lot of relatable stuff, what's going on now to World War II, and then of course the Cold War. We spent a good amount of time on that as well.
Good. So yeah, I reflect back on those times. Unfortunately, I did study to a bit an extent, but never to the extent I do now as an adult. But it's very exciting stuff. I can see why you were so indulged in it from like the beginning, and now as a history teacher. So I think it's good that we're going to cover that today, some historical events. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen now, and then I'm going to open the PowerPoint. And the reason why I'm doing the PowerPoint is I've always been more of a visual learner, and you and I can continue going back and forth, which is great. But I think for people to kind of grasp the ideas, they kind of need to see it visually to better understand it. So I'm going to do that now. So you should be seeing my screen, right, Tony?
Yeah. Nice picture of Wall Street.
I love Wall Street, yep. I like the concepts of it because it kind of gets you to know what's going on in the world. So again, guys, what we're going to cover is some historical events that happened in the past as it relates to what's going on today to an extent. We'll cover very briefly some statistics on what's going on with the COVID-19, Then we'll go more into extent with the Great Depression, Spanish flu, and whatnot, because a lot of those events are kind of correlating to what's going on now. We won't cover the actual disease of COVID-19. Reason being is we're all inundated with all that information today, and Tony and I would rather leave it to the experts and the scientists that are providing all that data versus us trying to cover that. But I will cover very briefly, and so will Tony, some things that we need to know about it. So Tony, you can go ahead and get this one.
All right. So the social science.
People can remember.
Yeah, I was telling Andrew that I didn't really. I left high school probably not being able to define what economics even is. You know, it says right here, social science that deals with the production, consumption, and expansion of wealth. As a high school teacher who's taught economics, you know, I always give the students an opportunity to define it themselves, and most kids say, oh, it's the study of money, or it's the study of stocks and bonds and things like that. But when you break it down to its core, it's really just the study of scarcity and choice, and how people make decisions, and incentives, you know, and the idea of opportunity cost. And so it's one of those subjects that I learned a lot by having to teach it. You know, when you're a social studies teacher in California, you don't exactly you get a teaching credential, but oftentimes teachers don't have a background in economics. Even though I'm a social studies teacher, my background is in history, and economics is something that's kind of taught within history, but you don't learn how economics work, and how incentives, for instance, or change the way we make decisions. But from a teaching perspective, I had to teach the kids the basics. You know, how do markets work, and what can change the supply and demand curves, and what is, for instance, opportunity costs and trade-offs. Those basic ideas. So I get an opportunity to just kind of teach kids the basics, and then I really feel that if economics was taught better, everybody would make a lot better decisions in their everyday life. It really changes the way you see things. Politics, for instance, especially will be changed, especially if you understand how the basics work. You know.
No, I totally agree. I know how important it is, and unfortunately, a lot of us kind of forget what we learned in the past, whether you know, it was taught in a manner that it was difficult to understand, because as you were saying the other day, as you're younger, you don't have too much perspective on things, and on top of that, maybe you're just not into the subject matter. I find myself sometimes forgetting some things about economics, so I try and brush on it all the time. I remember going into college, I didn't really know. I couldn't define it either, economics. I had to look back, and then we started getting into the micro and macroeconomics and the difference between the two, and how it affects our lives every day. It's really a science, the behavior of people and transactions, from credit, income, and everything like that with the money supply. So yeah, thank you for covering that.
They call it the dismal science sometimes. But it's a behavior. I think it's a behavioral science. You know, you see how people make decisions, and that's always really interesting. You know, so you get to clear up a lot of misconceptions when you teach it at the high school level, like the concept of free. It's always really fun to what does the word free really mean, you know? And then you end up teaching the kids about, you know, that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and going over what that specifically means, because a lot of kids mess that idea up, you know. But
yeah,
you could really revolutionize the way people think by teaching them basic economics and teaching it well.
exactly. And that's why we're covering it now for adults too, because at the end of the day, we're all human. We all forget. If we don't practice it on a daily basis, we'll end up forgetting some of the foundations that we should have known. So I think this is very, very important today. I'm going to go to the next slide on how the coronavirus has started to affect our economy, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And that's why it's a pandemic. It's being spread all over the world. So here's two graphs. I did like the left graph was kind of gives you a better idea on how badly it's affected our United States economy by the jobless claims that have already been filed. In the first 3 weeks of this going on, because of the shelter in place, it's affecting consumers and businesses. They're not able to, make transactions, and the confidence starts to deteriorate. And because of that, that's why you see all these jobless claims shoot up. As of yesterday, Tony, I saw was 16.5 million now. Last week it was at 10 million. And the unemployment rate in February, as you know, we've had a fantastic unemployment rate for a couple of years now, but in March it shot up to 4.5. But that's not really hitting the reality of what's going on now. Now they're saying that by May next month, because we're in April right now, or June of 2020, we'll hit 16%, which is quite scary, considering what's going on and how long this can continue going on for. I also saw in the Wall Street Journal, some economists believe that our GDP will start to recover in the second half of the year, but that can kind of be fairly optimistic too. They're thinking that the GDP will start to go up 6.2%, and then in the third quarter, and in the fourth, it'll go up 6.6%. And then by 2020, we'll be back to about a 3% growth. But from what I was reading, the GDP has been hit about 25% already. So it's not a pretty picture right now, but hopefully, it doesn't continue for too long. So here's the next one. So here's kind of historical data going back from the Great Depression in the 1930s all the way until right now. They're predicting, here's the projections that a bunch of economists have. The pessimistic ones don't think we're going to be recovering this year. It's going to be a total loss in GDP. It's going to contract every quarter, as you can see right here up into the fourth quarter. The baseline thinks that, as I mentioned from the past slide, that economists believe that GDP will start to go up the second half of the year. So if that's the case, that would be great, even if it's one year loss. If not, it can end up like the Great Depression and last multiple years at a time. And that's kind of what we don't want to be into. Same thing within the financial crisis. It only lasted about from 2007 to 2009. So a lot of people say what's going on right now with the economy isn't due to actual loss in GDP from like the transactions of economics and things like that. It's just because of this disaster. So if that's the case, hopefully it's a V shape where it's a major contraction and then it steeply goes up when we're out of this shelter in place, or it's a U shape where it's a little bit more of a longer bottom and then it starts to come back up. But nobody really knows. This could last a lot longer than we expect.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people are asking right now, because we're already kind of getting used to this lifestyle, this distance everything. And one of the things that I've noticed, just, if you take a walk along the street or even go to the grocery store, the way people are kind of looking at each other, they're kind of, they don't know what to expect. They don't know if you have it, or, they just want to protect themselves. So that's going to definitely, that fear, that paranoia of who has coronavirus is going to not just last through when the government says, everything's all good, you guys can go back to work or start, people are going to look at each other with that stare, so to say, of fear. And that's ultimately a reaction that we're going to see for a good amount of time. How long? I don't know. And
and there's also like a stigma going on. I was reading into the news how people are afraid of, like you were kind of mentioning, people have to go out with masks, and people have that stigma about masks where they're not really comfortable wearing it. But I think now people are starting to shift their mindset that it's kind of an okay thing to do now. So that's why I think once this is hopefully done and over with sooner than later, I think there's going to be a culture change to an extent where people are going to be a little bit more better with hygiene. Or what happens a lot in history too is people kind of just forget a large event. They just go on with their lives like nothing happened. But because of the dramatic extent of what's happened in our economy and health, I think people may actually change the culture a little bit more. and shaking hands may not happen as much as before.
Hmm. Yeah, it's
So,
ultimately this. If you're talking about markets and the economy, it translates to, you know, the consumer market, how it's going to shift, how it's going to change. It's very interesting to think of how the after effects are going to impact the market. You know,
mhm.
more markets, I should say.
Yeah, and that's why we were going to cover very briefly the Spanish flu. I did some digging from the past, and there was a lot of deaths in the United States from this back in 1918 when it began. 675,000 deaths. And then as far as worldwide, it was as little as 50 to at most 100 million death
Yeah,
rate
those are just
worldwide.
estimates.
Yeah, estimates. But if you make it equivalent to today's numbers based on the population now, they're supposedly saying that's equivalent to about 225 million people dying today. So when you look at the gravity of this current pandemic, it's still pretty small, but we don't know how long it can go on for. So I think what we're doing a lot better now is a lot of people have more. I mean, we've always had the freedom of speech, but there was some things that kind of suppressed it a bit, which was the Sedition Act by Woodrow Wilson that he did for World War I. He didn't want a lot of people talk, even the press especially, negative about the war. And since the Spanish flu is to an extent correlated with the Spanish flu, they also didn't want news to come out on how many deaths occurred in the United States and in the U.S. military. So that that was very important. That's why I think I fell to this ignorance about the Spanish flu. I actually thought it started in Spain, but then I was doing some digging, and that's why you got to do research, right? As an adult, you have to read. Everybody's got to read and understand things, but the only reason why it's called a Spanish flu is because they were the first ones to report it. They were neutral in World War I. They weren't part of the Allied or Central Powers, and the Allies nor the Central Powers wanted to cover the Spanish flu deaths in there because they didn't want to show how many losses they had in their military, because that would end up making them more weak, in the perception-wise. So, yeah, that's good to know. And from what I was seeing, they don't really know where the Spanish flu started. I don't know if you've looked into that.
No, there's different understandings of where it came from, but ultimately, what a lot of people don't remember. Well, a lot of people don't remember what this was, anyways. But it's in the backdrop of World War One. Remember, World War One lasted 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, and the numbers are pretty incredible. Like, again, when you kind of put it in the context of how many people died in the actual fighting in the trenches versus how many died with this pandemic, like 675,000 deaths in the United States. We only lost about 125,000 soldiers in World War One, American deaths. So in terms of death, this disease killed a lot more people in the grand scheme of things. And a lot of I've heard different things. I've read different things about, that it might have came from, because the trenches were disgusting places especially along the Western Front, where fighting was taking place mainly between British and French soldiers and German soldiers. But you're talking about, disease often killed more people fighting than did the actual fighting, right? And this is the first real mechanized world war, and machine guns mowing down people. People forget things like trench foot that was a bacterial fungal infection of your feet because of the rain, the moisture, would eventually would turn into a gangrenous disease that would kill you off. And a lot of people think that this was some kind of a bred from the trenches themselves.
Yeah. I also heard too, I mean, like you were saying, no one really knows, but there's different theories on where it started. I think that could be a big reason because there was no cleanliness, really. It was really horrific during World War One. I think it was even worse in World War Two, right? To an extent
that World War One was more of a it was what we call, it was typified by stalemate. Meaning you were stuck, right? Very little movement along the front lines, and trench warfare is kind of what really just kind of typified the war itself. Where in World War II, there was a lot more movement. Trench warfare was obsolete by the start of World War II because you had fast moving tanks, that could
Got it.
mow over barbed wire, could mow over trenches themselves. And you even had planes. We when World War I started, people left, as one historian said, started fight. We're fighting still on cavalry. We're actually going into the battlefield against the enemy, against machine guns on horses, and we flew out in planes. Planes were used, especially by the end of the war. Planes were used more often. So the war had completely shifted us in terms of
from the
technology.
technology, yeah. So the conditions weren't so horrific in a way from the trench warfare in World War I.
I guess disease
in some ways.
Yeah, in some ways for sure.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is I was also reading into it that it looks like they also thought it might have started in China in 1917. There were some respiratory issues going on. A lot of people in China were dying, and then it took about a year later for it to go worldwide, but nobody really knows, unfortunately. But the positive of what's going on now versus back then is, our science is a lot more improved, our technology, and people have more freedom to kind of dig into things and talk about things a lot better than back then for the press. And from my understanding, there wasn't any ICUs back then either, like they do today. So that was good. Back then, they also did do social distancing efforts like we have today. They wore masks, but they kind of did it a little later in the game than I think we did. And there was no signs back then, from my understanding, to wash your hands like there is now. So that's kind of what made this loss happen wider than what may happen now with COVID.
Well, people still back then were, even 100 years ago, our knowledge of science was just much different, and people were still doing very primitive type of how do I say, cures, and bloodletting, for instance, I think was still used in places in the United States, and we know that's not something that you want to do, especially because of the bacterial infections that could be caused by that. There was too many unknowns, where today the effects of the disease, they're going to be horrible. Don't get me wrong, you're going to see death, but you're not going to see them on the same levels that you saw 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. You can't compare it in the same sense.
Yeah. I'm gonna go on to the Great Depression now. It's kind of funny how, no, it's not funny at all actually, but it's just interesting how we have this COVID-19 sort of related to Spanish flu in 1918, 100 years ago, and then the Great Depression, which is we're going to hit on next, how it was affected so badly and quickly on GDP and the overall economy altogether. But what makes it crazy is in the Roaring 20s, right? In the Roaring 20s in history, unemployment rate was around 3.2% or so, and we had that for a while in 2017, 18, 19, 20, and then this happened. So, really quickly, just to touch really quick on the statistics of COVID-19 in America. So far, there's been 16,000 deaths. So it's a lot smaller than the Spanish flu, but that Spanish flu was a long time ago, so we have all that data right now. Things are still not even done yet, and we still need to measure all that. So, Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1933, and from my understanding, it kind of picked up again as far as the decline in the economy in around 1935 or so, and it continued on. Is that right, Tony? I believe so. It was like a 10-year depression. It came in two waves, though. Went down, up, and then down, and then it went back up.
Well, it was the first off, I think what people need to kind of know, when I teach this from a high school perspective, I have to go over these words with kids, with vocabulary, and because it's not an economics class, I have to kind of stick vocabulary for the students. So
Yeah.
A depression is just a prolonged recession, and a
Hmm.
recession is essentially a loss in consumer, especially spending. So right now we're in the midst of a recession. How long it's going to be is really determines whether it's going to be depression or not. A depression is
Hmm.
usually, I think, measured by like six. No, how does it?
I know it's years
I believe
versus
over. I believe.
recession
Yeah.
quarters.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, but the in terms of that upturn in the market, it took about a decade for it to really recover.
Hmm.
And it was World War II in the case of the United States that really brought us out of the depression. Not so much government spending or something like like a lot of historians or a lot of people are under the misconception that it was FDR that brought us out of the Great Depression, but it was a very very slow economic upturn
Hmm.
from this time period.
Yeah. And that's why in a recession, same with depression, it's obviously loss of GDP, but it's also the loss of business and consumer confidence. And when you start seeing banks fail, you lose your job. Everybody starts to lose confidence, obviously. And what people need to know too, I do like that you mentioned about the definitions, but in the economy, there's what's called the business cycle, which is the expansion and contraction of the economy. So when things are good, we're expanding, and then things start contracting, and that's the recession. So it's like a roller coaster ride. Um, so that's really important for people to understand that. And from my understanding too, in the Great Depression, they were basically reaching a contraction period, right? There was a dust bowl with the farmers and things like that, where the dust was ruining crops, from what I know, and it started causing issues with food supply and things like that. Farmers lost a lot of jobs, and overall the economy was coming down. But the major thing, from my understanding, is the Great Depression continued for so long because the Federal Reserve at that time, their monetary policy, they tightened the machine, the money supply. They started contracting it. They raised interest rates when they maybe should have. That's what Ben Bernanke was saying, the chairman back in 2008. He studied the Great Depression and said what they probably should have done was loosen the money supply and lowered interest rates.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. A
and
lot of people. Yeah, sorry. I mean,
oh, and
you were saying.
I was just going to finish saying that in addition to that, the government wasn't too involved either. It was more of a laissez-faire economic theory from Adam Smith, and let it be, let the economy play itself out, which does work. But what they were saying is that they wanted some government intervention so they can kind of stimulate the economy and provide, to an extent, welfare for people. And that's kind of where FDR came in and did a lot of government spending on infrastructure and things like that. And as you were saying, Tony, it did help kind of get us out of the depression a little bit. But what it really came down to, it was World War II.
Mhm. Yeah. What I've taught my students, especially at the senior level when I'm teaching economics and you're trying to teach kids how money works, for instance, and this, especially paper currency, and we do little experiments. And one of the things that I actually do with my world history students is show them what is something, like monetary inflation, like how can you inflate prices. But what a lot of people think is that the Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash of 29. And
Mm-hmm.
like you pointed out, it wasn't exactly that. It was a failure of the Federal Reserve to keep the confidence of Americans in what is a promissory note, the American banknote. A lot of people don't know this, but we actually were in a recession leading up to the stock market crash of 29. The stock
Correct.
market crash was just one thing, and rather than put more money into supply, the Federal Reserve didn't do that at the right rate, and therefore, this is no way to say I don't think that the Great Depression could have been avoided completely. I think the depression would have happened anyways.
Mm-hmm.
It's what made it great was essentially that the Federal Reserve didn't do what it should have, which was to ensure that, for instance, if Americans went to the bank, that they can take their money out, right?
Yeah. The
So
FDIC wasn't around back then. That one policy, you're insured up to $100,000, right? And that's where
right,
they
there was,
instituted that
yeah,
later.
yeah, bank reserves were not there. So Americans were going to their bank trying to take out their hard-earned money, and there was nothing there. So of course, people, as a reaction, they had the incentive for instance, to start doing what the government was doing, which was hoarding money. People were literally hiding money in their walls and their attics and because they didn't want to put it back into circulation. And the government had that at that point, had the government actually, or the Fed in particular, if it had revved up the money and kept it in supply, then we
Hmm.
wouldn't have seen a Great Depression. It would have been, a recession, but it wouldn't have.
Yeah.
And we're actually, a lot of people don't know this, but I think in 99 and 2000, the same things were happening in terms of the market that were happening in or prior to the Great Depression starting, the stock market crash.
Yeah.
But the reason we didn't feel that same type of prolonged recession was because the government, the Fed, basically sped up the money
Stimulating.
supply and stimulated the economy a little bit more.
Yeah. And I
So
think that's what they learned from that Great Depression was the fact that unfortunately they need to be more involved a little bit more as opposed to the free market, which
mhm,
I do agree. I mean, I'm not going to touch on that subject, but I agree with the free market more than anything than government intervention. But I do believe there needs to be somewhat of a balance. So I think that's
right.
kind of what we ended up learning from the Great Depression. And, automatically now, I think it took about a year and a half or so during 2008 for the Federal Reserve to really get involved and start quantitative easing and lowering interest rates to zero and doing things like that. Right now, as soon as this happened with this pandemic, with COVID-19, immediately they started doing quantitative easing, lowering interest rates, and then Congress started doing the government intervention, which was from Keynes, right? The Keynes theory, which was
Yeah.
essentially the government helped stimulate the economy too, and that's why they were able to successfully do the I think it's 2.1 trillion stimulus package, and I think now Nancy Pelosi is talking about doing another 2 trillion stimulus package, so essentially 4 trillion, which
Yeah,
is crazy.
if anybody listening to this or reading up on how the government has kind of evolved from, kind of taking a back seat in the economy towards like becoming more involved, they have to look up Maynard James Keynes, which
Hmm.
was a British economist who believed that the government should stimulate the economy through, monetary and fiscal policy, taxes, for instance, lowering taxes and things like that, taking a more active role
Hmm.
in the economy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Government spending is kind of what he was for, lowering taxes, I believe, too. Those two things. And then people also should look into Milton Friedman as well. He was more on the monetary side, I think. And essentially, he was saying how instead of the government stimulating the economy, it should be more of the Federal Reserve that should kind of do that. And from my understanding, there's a Fed funds interest rates, which lower the interest rates for when banks allow each other to borrow. So they set that interest rate. There's a discount rate where banks can go to the Federal Reserve and borrow directly from the banks. So I know currently they lowered it to zero, the federal funds rate. The discount rate, they lowered it to so banks can, borrow from the Federal Reserve. And then quantitative easing is buying securities, essentially printing money, which stimulates the economy too. And it works with the government because they get access to that cash and start stimulating through government.
Right.
I know that can be kind of a lot, but um,
I
yeah.
think for and I'm not an expert in a lot of this stuff, but one of the things that I learned, especially from some of my coworkers, one lady in particular, she talked about how we think about money. For instance, the money that you have in your wallet or your purse, for instance, is not your money. It's essentially borrowed. It's something that it's a commodity that you trade, but
Hmm.
it's borrowed at a certain percent, from the Federal Reserve to your district banks, from your district bank to your local banks and then to you. So
Hmm.
it's essentially a constant, like I had this concept for a long time that when I took my money to, especially in high school, that you take it to the
Yeah,
bank and they put it in a vault and there it is
that's
forever,
it.
right? But
Yeah.
the banks actually, they make money off of your money. They, they lend money out, for instance. They assess their risks and lend to individuals. They invest in real estate, and then they also invest in stocks and bonds and other things like that, right? So
Hmm.
now what the difference is that the government requires that the banks have a certain amount of reserves, right? So that when times like this, when people might be more panicked or unsure about their future, they can take their money from the bank and still be able to spend it the way they want, right? But that's because we've learned a lot from the past of what not to do. At least
Yeah.
more people, for instance, if I go to the bank, I can be sure to get my money out or some cash or whatever, right? But there's that constant, there's a little bit
And
more
that's
protection in that sense.
why a lot of it comes down to credit. And if you use it responsibly, I mean, the whole point of in economics is production. You want it to continue going up, up, up. But
Mhm.
if you use it responsibly, credit, and you leverage yourself, then if you're able to produce more income, then you essentially can pay off your debt, your credit, and continue making that profit. But if you use it irresponsibly and are just over leveraging yourself and not producing any income, then that's kind of where things hit that domino effect and a recession happens like that. But that's why, like we were saying earlier, Tony, or I think you mentioned, it's really a science and behavior, because it all comes down to incentive with interest rates and things like that. If you see a low interest rate, you're going to want to go ahead and get a loan, right? And if you see high interest
Right.
rates, there's going to be less people that want to do that. So, one person's spending is another person's income. And whoever's watching this, I also think, aside from what we were just saying about Milton Friedman, and then what was the other? I know Keynes theory, but what's his Maynard Keynes, right? Maynard something
Yeah.
Keynes.
Yeah.
Yeah, look into those two guys, and then I would also look into the video from Ray Dalio. He runs the biggest hedge fund. It's called "How the Economic Machine Works," and he kind of digs into it a lot deeper. I think it's like a 30-minute video. Um,
Yeah.
so, I want to touch
One
on
of
one last slide. I think. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Tony.
just, there's something that stands out to me. Again, this person, I don't want to name them because I don't want them to kind of, you know, but this person, I think working with her helped change the way a lot of the things that I thought about. She said very smartly, she said, if you save when times are good, you spend when times are bad. So people who are able to make an income right now, they're doing the most just because they have that incentive. The market is showing them opportunities. They're going to be able to spend money and continue to, take good opportunities like that. And other people
Yeah,
are going to, who did not save during good times, they're going to struggle a lot more. So
yeah.
there's a lot of good opportunity right now. So it's not all doom and gloom for people right now.
Hmm.
There's a lot of, the market is still going, it's shifting. That's what's awesome about a free market. It just, I know it's uncertain for a lot of people, but there's actually a lot of opportunity right now for a
Oh,
lot of people.
definitely. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of people in the world that look forward to these times. A recession, you buy a bunch of assets at a cheaper price, and then when economy starts going up again, these assets start rising, and things like that. So it's always good to
Mhm.
save some money. Cash is king in many ways, as well. And if you have that uh, savings, the rainy day fund like the states do, um, that ultimately can help you in times like these. And people that are getting from the stimulus package, those checks, I mean, aside from paying your expenses, if you're still getting paid, you might want to use that to save, store it in your savings account, or pay off your debt, or maybe start investing. But you just got to be very responsible.
Mhm.
So I guess this last slide is by Greg Ip. Tony, I actually had the pleasure of speaking to him a couple times before. He's on the Wall Street Journal. He's an economist. I spoke to him via email multiple times. We were actually supposed to meet in DC, but then, things happened and now this. But he essentially had a piece in the Wall Street Journal that I really enjoyed. And he basically said, although this can be tied to an extent of the depression, it also is a disaster. And he kind of was mentioning how in the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, when that impacted them, it was a 30% unemployment rate, from my understanding. And that 30% stayed there for a while. 2 years later, they were only able to come back up halfway. So the point is to not have a post fate like Katrina. And I think that's why the government and the Federal Reserve is so involved right now, so that this doesn't bottom out for too long like the Great Depression. And then there's a quote right there people can read as well from him to have a better understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think what ultimately everything is about balance, and I think a lot of people, you're going to have a lot of talks and debates about how much the government should be stepping in right now, but and it's hard for a person like me, for instance, to gauge how much exactly the government should step in. But a lot of the time I'm more of the person that thinks as long as the government kind of, has more of a laissez-faire policy, hands off, that you're going to see a lot of people be better off in the end, as opposed to when the government says, puts all these limits and restrictions on certain things. You're going to see a lot of people with less of what they need, but there's always a role for government when it comes to anything, that's including a natural. This is exactly what he said about this being comparable to a natural disaster. There's going to be businesses that cannot do their business as a result. But
I totally agree in that concept too, with let the free market play itself out. I think if it intervenes too much, people lose incentive to produce. That productivity line starts to go away, and people just start to, depend more on the handout in a way. So I agree with that. But there's always that balance. And that's why it's difficult for people, I think, that are listening to the news that don't study any of this. Problem is, people will say something very vague and they can make it fit their narrative, and they can make it swing one way or the other. And depending on what you tend to consume the most in the media or social media too, that can kind of change the ways that you look at things. So I think that's truly important. I think that's probably why you are so keen on teaching your students, right?
yeah, in the end, I always want to just get the kids to understand basic concepts, for instance, I always one of the things I always remember, a student of mine, because I have my students do like little reflections at the end of the year, let me know what I did well, what I could have done better as a teacher, and they're always really honest, and they say some things that are really, always stand out to me. One student of mine, we were talking about money supplies, for instance, and how can the government impact an economy by, for instance, printing too much money and versus not enough money or something like that. And a student of mine was talking about, he wrote in there, he's like, I was able to explain to my dad, for instance, how, because the father was looking at the news and he said, well, why doesn't the government just print out
Endless
give
money.
everybody give everybody $1 million, if they just printed $1 billion for every person, then everybody would be out of poverty. Well, that student was able to explain to the father what monetary inflation is, and how, for instance, the government can inflate prices too much by printing money too quickly, like what we saw recently in Venezuela, or if you're looking at 1920s Germany, the same
did
thing
too.
happened. They ruined their economy because the government, had reparations to pay for the war as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, and basically they inflated their prices so much that money was worthless. So but my point was that student was able to explain to the dad, this is what happens because we were able to do a little experiment in the classroom using something simple like beans and some candy bars, something that gives the kids, a little incentive to play a little bit of a bargaining game. And they were like, okay, now I understand a little bit more how this works.
Yeah. I mean, it's extremely important, and I'm glad to hear stories like that. Hopefully, they continue where the youth is learning and even teaching their parents if they didn't have that education or they didn't bother to do any reading and stuff like that. So I can commend you for being a good teacher, and actually caring for your students and making sure that they have an idea of what's going to be like in the real world. Because when you're a student, you don't really know until you're out making money on your own and no one's there to really take care of you other than yourself and maybe some family, but you're on your own.
Yeah,
Really.
and that's what we kind of talked a little bit about earlier, was that, you know, when it comes to the social studies, kids, you know, find it probably, you know, once they walk into a history class, they automatically are like, oh man, this is gonna be right. And I think it's just because you have to make it really relatable to the kids, and that's always the a big struggle with teaching the social studies, is that if you don't make it relatable to the kids, and how, you know, show them how it, you know, a decision by the government or how their own individual decisions are impacting what their trajectory of their life, then they're not going to get it. But it's something that you and I, and most kids will appreciate much later on, once they have that perspective that they didn't care about as kids. I did have to fix one thing. I knew I messed up his name. His name is John Maynard Keynes. The other guy that I mentioned was it was the Brit. Yeah, the other name, I think I was the lead singer of the band Tool.
Really? Oh shoot!
They both
all I remember is Keynes. That's all I remember.
They both share the name Maynard. That's why. But anyways, it's John.
I'm glad
Maynard
you
Keynes.
mentioned that. Yeah.
I was like, I knew. I was like, yeah, I'm a fan of that of that group too. So.
That's funny. I always know it from Keynesian theory.
Keynesian economics, yeah.
Keynesian economics,
Milton Friedman. Yeah, Milton Friedman is a beast. When it comes
he had a contrary argument to him.
Yeah, well, he was more of a, he was definitely more of a
free capitalist.
Adam Smith free, because Milton Friedman was a Nobel Prize winning economist who showed
he was brilliant
through data and research. He showed how, for instance, government often screwed things up that it thought were going to be the solution to problems, right? And that's what, you know, people have to follow their head, not so much their heart, right? And it's,
the logic usually wins. I mean, I'm planning to buy a Milton Friedman shirt soon. So the next time I do a talk, I'm going to be wearing that. I'm a big fan of that guy.
Free to choose, man.
Yeah, it's important. That's why I think this video is good too that we did, because it's going to be adults watching, or so I hope a lot of them see it, because as adults, we play catch up sometimes. We forget what we learned in the past, or we didn't pay attention. And then we just got to play catch up and try to learn it again. And then sometimes it's too late and you're already consumed by what you see on TV or what you see on social media, that you just become more and more ignorant. So I think that's important. So I do appreciate your time today, and maybe we can jump on another one later if this continues. Hopefully not. Huh?
All right. Yeah, I hope it gets better than worse.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Who knows? Yeah, man, I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on your show.